So, just as with Brian Pead, the police get their headlines in the local press, in this case the News Shopper, but the real story of what the police got up to is not gone into and doesn't come out. In actual fact, in this case, these two brothers were driving to Greenwich near the Woolwich flyover. In the car with him was his brother Asante and two female friends. At around 6 p.m. the car was brought to a hard stop by armed officers in an unmarked car. The officers shot out the tyres, smashed out the car side windows and proceeded to thrust their weapons into the faces of the Williams brothers. They then dragged him and the three passengers out of the car. Officers used tasers and pain compliance techniques on the men who did not resist at any point during the arrest. Officers accused the brothers of being terrorists and accused of having repeatedly racially abused them at the time the arrest was reported in the local newspapers. Due to the severity of the injuries of his head, Asante was taken to hospital in the assistance of paramedics and no charges were made against him. The police explained that the car was targeted because it was linked with an address associated with Lee Rigby's murder. The address in question was that of Mr. Williams' cousin, a black Muslim who has not been approached by police to date. Hassani was charged with possession of a Class A drug, but crucially, despite the nature of the stop, was not charged with any offence related to terrorism. A court hearing, which took place in October, put the trial back on a warned list to the 6th of April for unspecified reasons. In November, Hassani pleaded not guilty at a hearing at Woolwich Crown Court. On the 8th of January, the prosecution formally offered no evidence in respect to this charge, just as with one of Brian Pead's cases. A complaint about the way the Williams brothers were treated is currently being investigated, and they are also preparing to pursue a civil case against the Metropolitan Police. And that's the two Williams brothers. It seems that Andrew Parks, the group editor of NewsQuest and the News Shopper in South London, is rather concerned about new libel laws being proposed by the present Conservative government. He says here, if you believe in your right to know and the freedom of speech, you really must act now. Well, that's rather interesting, isn't it? Because Andrew Parks doesn't seem to have a very good record on any of those. Well, he certainly believes in his freedom of speech on some very controversial things, but he doesn't seem to believe in balanced or good journalism from the record of his newspaper, as can be seen in the case of Brian Pead, amongst others. And there are more cases I could name. This article about Brian Pead is not balanced, and the comments section, people raised many points, but like other people, Andrew Parks chooses to ignore them. Did any journalists get sent to by Andrew Parks to Brian Pead's house to go over the things that were raised in the comments section on this article about the faults in his story? Or his newspaper story on Brian Pead? No, absolutely not. And Brian Pead never had any journalists talk to him from the News Shopper on his doorstep to get his side of the story, because Andrew Parks is only interested in the police's side of the story and the official narrative on things. And in fact, he's not really about the small guy or the local person. And especially if it involves advertising in his newspaper and who's paying for advertising in his newspaper. Suddenly stories are no longer publishable if certain people who are paying for advertising might be damaged by that story, as can be seen with a certain local hospital. It seems like, as George Orwell said in Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Certainly to Andrew Parks anyway. I mean, here's something that Snooper, aka in my opinion Andrew Parks, says at 10:58 p.m. on Thursday the 4th of February 2010. I would be very surprised if the police stopped their investigations on this pervert. Andrew Parks or Snooper, whoever you are, on what basis could you do you make that comment? Do you know this person very well? Such people have others they brag to and swap stories with, lurking in the background. That said, this case demonstrates a number of issues we should be concerned about, and he goes on and on talking about the usual things Andrew Parks talks about, which is quite interesting. Well, I would come back to that. Well, isn't it interesting that Brian Pead didn't have any child pornography on his computers? A very good point that's made by Dorothy Walgar further down this comment feed. Andrew Parks, of course, or Snoop or whoever it is, completely ignores that point. that in fact most so-called perverts actually do have pornography on their computer if they are actually really perverts, and because that's the sort of thing that they do, and they quite rightly get into trouble for it. But they never seem to have had any on Brian Pead, which is rather interesting. And in his 50s, he'd never broken any laws or been done for anything. So I don't really know what Andrew Parks or Snoop or whoever thinks they have the right to go after him in this way. He had a very long career in teaching. If he had done something wrong, he had more than decades of opportunities to have done something wrong or inappropriate. And in fact, Pink Kitten on this comment feed points out that she had Brian Pead as one of her teachers. He was my English teacher in secondary school, and always made his lessons fun and enjoyable, and I never experienced him behaving in an inappropriate manner. So there you go. On Thursday, March the 2nd, 2017, this headline came out in the Daily Mirror. Ricky Tomlinson's claims Countdown's Richard Whiteley was an MI5 spy. Star blames host for getting him jailed over union strikes. This may sound far-fetched, but actually when you look into it more closely, Ricky Tomlinson points out the security services use media people as part of the intelligence services. I must have done Countdown 4 or 5 times, he says. I didn't know at the time that this was the case, that Richard Whiteley was connected with the attempts to have Ricky Tomlinson put in prison. Whiteley fronted a documentary called Red Star Under the Bed that showed unions in a bad light and was screened as the jury in Ricky Tomlinson's trial in the 1970s without deliberating. Paul O'Callaghan tried to get a hospital referral to a hospital in Essex, but this was turned down by the old Bromley Health Authority on the ground of finite funds. The new shopper was not interested in this story. This is beta-histine hydrochloride, 8 milligrams. This is a photocopy from many years ago of one that Paul O'Callaghan had in 2005, as you can see his name along there. It's a well documented condition, vertigo. Dawn French suffers from it, as can be seen here. Dawn, I battle with vertigo on stage. It's like being drunk without alcohol. Since being on the medication after 9 years of being without it, he was eventually, Paul, able to write books on railways that he'd wanted to do, including this one, East Sussex Coastal Railway. Well, in June 2017 it seems that Andrew Parks, the editor of NewsQuest of several London local newspapers, is now finally being investigated by the police himself. It seems the shoe's on the other foot, Andrew, isn't it? Papers must not feel intimidated, he says. And yet it was Andrew Parks, who Paul O'Callaghan quoted in 2004, but I won't say what Andrew Parks said. Yes, and also Andrew Parks wrote in 2004, I would encourage readers to put Mr. O'Callaghan's newsletter where it belongs, in the bin. Well, that's very helpful to one of your readers who came to you for help years previously, Andrew. Andrew Parks has a lot to say in his weekly newspapers, as you can see. I think he has a big ego, and I'm quite sure that he wouldn't let criticism of his newspaper on its website go unanswered, although I could be mistaken. But I do think that Snooper, the username Snooper, in regards to the article about Brian Pead on the News Shopper website, is possibly Andrew Parks using a pseudonym, not wanting to let criticism of his newspaper go unanswered. Andrew Parks was criticised also by Paul O'Callaghan for failing to help him get a health referral by Bromley Health Authority to a hospital in Essex during the 1990s, before the two doctors in the recent court case of 2013-2015 were even involved. I wonder what Andrew Parks and the judges and magistrates would have to say about having to go to 8 DSS appeal tribunals and over 4 years to get just £27 per week, having to go without heating and basic necessities. Aren't the scales of justice supposed to be scales symbolically for a reason? Scales are supposed to weigh up things. Surely all things should be considered when justice is on the table, being considered. Prosecutor Louisa Thomas referred to some of Paul O'Callaghan's literature as a rant against the NHS. This is similar to Andrew Parks' journalist Richard Simcox in 2004, over 10 years ago, who referred to Paul's original leaflet as a 10-page rant when it was an appeal to Bromley residents for help, as regarding the next door neighbours and the lack of medical treatment for all those years, and the possibility that maybe there was more or more accurate treatment available, and of course the medical profession had shown themselves not to be reliable, having taken 9 years to prescribe a commonly available medication that had existed for decades. Referrals to Essex had been denied by the local health authority due to supposed lack of resources, although they managed to find £1,000 to donate to a Cray Youth Radio to use on the St Mary Cray estate, where subsequently the kids broke into the youth centre, as I understand it, and stole the radio equipment as gratitude for such help being lavished on them, while Paul and Christine, his mother, were left to rot. So-called caring Andrew Parks couldn't have cared less. He really wasn't interested, and he personally was quoted as saying in the News Shopper that Mr. O'Callaghan had made a series of accusations that were clearly made up. This is a man who purports to be about accurate journalism, but very clearly he isn't, as can be seen. Although the police officer that Paul O'Callaghan was accused of harassing and who he now has a restraining order on wasn't involved in the many call-outs to 11 Wimborne Avenue by Paul and his mother regarding their next-door neighbours, especially the elderly couple next door, I think it's worth pointing out that Bromley police failed utterly to do anything to help Paul and his mother with their next-door neighbours who were banging on the front door and trying to get them up in the middle of the day when they were asleep, because they didn't accept that they were ill, and they were quite an unpleasant elderly couple, and yet because they were elderly the police always believed what they said and not what Paul and his mother said, although this elderly couple, seemingly so sublime, actually would crash dustbin lids deliberately and bang on the front door and then run back to their house, and even encouraged local children to go in the front garden. Local children, as seen here, throwing stones at Paul and his mother's house. All this to try and get them up and victimise them in the neighbourhood, despite the fact that it took many hours for Paul to get to sleep.
Do you like chucking things at houses? Chucking stuff at windows? I just got your videotape throwing something. Your cat stands at a mile.
Is it?
Yeah. You're on videotape. You want to keep chucking things at the house? Do you two want to have a go at it? So prove you two as well as your friend here?
What do you mean?
Throwing things at windows. I've got videotape.
From?
Go get it.
What else? From?
I've got you, three of you standing up here outside the tree.
What tree?
Your t-shirt standing there as well.
This court case of June at Grange Magistrates of June 2013 should never have gone ahead. Paul O'Callaghan's own carer, his mother, hadn't expected it to go ahead on that day, and his defence witnesses were not ready. And Grange Magistrates flouted natural justice by allowing the case to go ahead on that day. Also, it needs to be borne in mind that the supposed threats that Paul made to the magistrates were political party policies and not something he would ever have done. Additionally, this photograph was taken by a photographer who was in the courtroom in the public gallery. Unbeknownst to Paul, when he came out of the magistrates at Greenwich, the photographer was over the road, and Paul heard a click, which was the photographer's camera. Interesting, this may not sound interesting, but it's interesting because in a different case brought against Paul, one of the things that they were complaining about when he was accused of harassing a police officer was that he had used a photograph off the Metropolitan Police website without permission, and obviously they were not very keen and not very happy about the material that he was publishing about that particular police officer because it wasn't very flattering. And yet this article, which is not very flattering and doesn't include many salient facts, is apparently okay officially, even though it's only half the story. And they haven't got Paul's side of the story. Didn't even interview him outside the magistrates. This is quite typical of what goes on. Additionally, what needs to be borne in mind is the case shouldn't have gone ahead on this day. His carer, who was his mother, wasn't even there because she hadn't expected it to go ahead. Neither had Paul, because his defence witnesses were not there, and the defence solicitor was actually sabotaging the case and wasn't interested in bringing the video evidence and was trying to persuade Paul to plead guilty. Incidentally, the British Unicorn Party is mentioned by the Liberal Democrat Mark Pack in March of this year, 2017. The Unicorn Party, along with a number of other political parties, has been deregistered by the Electoral Commission, who occasionally tidy up their list, so-called, getting rid of parties that they don't have up-to-date information about, although they may well still exist. And in fact, Mark Pack mentions in his article that the British Unicorn Party had 4 members on its Facebook page. Brian Pead has supported Norfolk farmer Tony Martin in his appeal of his conviction to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the conviction being from 1999 of the Norfolk farmer. Here is Tony Martin at a public meeting in 2017 criticising Norfolk police, especially with regard to one of his farms, which he says is regularly being burgled, and he's given up contacting the police for help. This year, in April the 4th, 2017, according to the website Lambeth Child Abuse and Cover-Up, it says that Brian Pead has yet again been arrested and was taken down all the way from Norfolk to London on the 4th of April to Bromley Magistrates Court for a 30-minute hearing before District Judge Dennis Lynch. This is a copy of the restraining order issued on Paul O'Callaghan at Greenwich Magistrates Court on the 12th of June 2013 and rubber stamped some weeks later at Bromley Magistrates Court by Magistrate Nigel Dean. Amongst the draconian points on this restraining order is not entering the London Borough of Bromley against Paul O'Callaghan's human right of having contact with a relative who lives there. He subsequently went to appeal over a year later at Croydon Crown Court before Recorder Judge June Venters QC, although there was no jury present, which is somewhat odd. At the end of the sentencing, there was rumour of him being sectioned under the Mental Health Act, which, in an absurd echo of the case number 1 in the Health Charter that Paul O'Callaghan had produced, which had been a part of the subject of this court case, was someone being sectioned to a psychiatric hospital when they were physically ill with a physical illness, as in the case of Sophia Mirza, who was case number 1 in the Health Charter report. The judges and magistrates have shown no concern for any of the people mentioned in the actual NHS patients mentioned in the Health Charter, such as Sophia Mirza, David Glass and his family, or indeed Elsie Devine, the late Elsie Devine, who died in 1999, and her daughter, who is still campaigning over 20 years later. No concern shown whatsoever. And this case has been made out to be entirely about 2 doctors, as far as I can see, and yet it's far bigger than that. Paul O'Callaghan has seen some 14 doctors up to 2014. Only one of those had prescribed the medication that he found was successful in easing his symptoms. His condition had deteriorated from 2012, at least as far as I know, and had become so bad that the ear noises and tinnitus were keeping him awake again at night and preventing him from going to sleep. There was talk of him having an operation, but this was then came to absolutely nothing. This condition has been going on for 20 years, unresolved, it seems.
First this evening, in a tragic medical first, a woman from the south has become the only patient in the world to have ME confirmed as her cause of death. For 7 years, Sophia Mirza, who was just 32, battled the crippling disease that many refused to even accept existed.
Sophia was committed to a psychiatric hospital, and her family claim this is what led to her death. Now they've been backed by a coroner who for the first time has put ME on her death certificate. Stacey Poole has our exclusive report.
Creona Wilson clings to the death certificate of the daughter she lost to ME.
It was a privilege to know her, and an even greater privilege to have her as a daughter.
She promised her daughter her life would not be lost in vain, and the fact it's now written in black and white Oxford's doctors can no longer dismiss this condition as a mental illness when it clearly can kill.
The day before she died, I told her that her life would affect hundreds of other people for the better.
To the core. Human rights abuses, inappropriate labelling of vexatious complainants, and the roles of the General Medical Council, Health Service Ombudsman and the Care Quality Commission, ICAS, PALS and CHCs, who pretend to serve the public and don't actually. Is that a bit harsh? I don't think so. Because as a doctor himself, Dr. Peter Wilmshurst points out in November 2006, and he did raise concerns with the Chief Medical Officer about the General Medical Council's fitness to act as a regulator. The General Medical Council's older rules that prohibits a doctor from saying things that might harm the reputation of another doctor. What kind of regulatory body has a rule over doctors that does that? Or over its members, more to the point, that does that? Because that's not for whistleblowing. That's against whistleblowing. And then to add to the problems, you've got the British Medical Association that are based here in Tavistock Square in London, who, by the way, opposed the founding of the National Health Service in 1948. Yes, not all doctors are socialists. The British Medical Association continues to oppose direct public elections to NHS boards. This was a press statement from a number of years ago. The BMA believes that there is a risk that individuals with political aspirations or representatives from single-issue campaign groups could seek election to NHS boards to progress their own political careers, or use the NHS board as a mechanism to further a single cause. They certainly don't want people like Anne Reeves, whose mother dies at Gosport War Memorial Hospital, getting elected onto the board of the hospital in order to find out why her mother died and who was responsible. That's really the reason, surely. Because who else could they be thinking of? Because politicians don't really care about hospitals or the NHS. They pretend they care or think they care, but when it actually comes down to it, time and time again, they've failed to listen to the sort of concerns that are raised in letters like this. All these concerns have been raised by so many people going back into the 1990s. Nothing has changed, and it still hasn't changed in 2017, although thankfully we do have a duty of candour now, thanks to the campaigning of Mr. Powell on behalf of his son Robbie Powell's case. We at least have Robbie's law. This letter, by the way, was received by Andy Burnham MP on the 29th of January 2010 and witnessed, and you can see it was signed by a number of people. And Mr. Powell is well documented on he did actually manage to get some publicity on the internet and from TV and so on for his case. Thankfully, some stuff does get out to the public. On the 12th of May 2017, the South London Press ran this article: Superhead Tunstall is suspended. It seems Lambeth are at it again. Lambeth Council have suspended yet another head teacher. I wonder what it is this time. James Walker, of course, was suspended, and it was subsequently a constructive dismissal for which he won damages whilst battling cancer. And Brian Pead was also dismissed and suspended from his job as a head teacher of the Open Learning School, a pupil referral school in Lambeth, after a series of concocted allegations. One has to wonder, what is it this time? Is it the usual politics that go on in councils and in schools where career-minded staff do coup d'etats to oust the head teacher with bogus allegations, or is this because they're paying him too much money and they can't find a better reason to get rid of him and replace him with somebody on less money? Who knows?